It starts with the reality that this moment around the Detroit Lions feels heavy with expectations and decisions because everything connects. When the NFL announced the finalists for the 2025 NFL Honors, the Lions once again had one of their own in the spotlight. Aiden Hutchinson is a finalist for 2 end-of-season awards, Defensive Player of the Year and Comeback Player of the Year, and just seeing his name there tells a story about who he is and what he represents for this team. Now, let's be honest and keep this grounded. Defensive Player of the Year is almost certainly not happening, and that is not disrespect to Hutchinson at all. Myles Garrett dominated this season, led the league in sacks, and that award is essentially locked up. Where the real conversation lives is Comeback Player of the Year, and that one feels real, meaningful, and earned. Coming back from a broken leg and still producing 14.5 sacks, consistently generating pressure, and being a constant problem for opposing offenses is not normal. That is elite resilience, elite preparation, and elite talent. This is exactly why many people believed, even before the season began, that Hutchinson could be in this position. He is a recognizable name, a face of the franchise, and he backed it up on the field when it mattered. And when you talk about Hutchinson, you naturally start talking about how this team is built to support stars like him, which takes us straight into the draft conversation. Mel Kiper Jr. released his latest mock draft and has the Lions selecting at pick 17. His projection is interior offensive lineman Olusegun Oluwatimi. No, correction. He has the Lions selecting guard Algiga Aon, a massive 6 feet 4 inches, 330-pound guard out of Penn State. His logic is simple. The Lions were near the bottom of the league in pass block win rate, finishing 31st at 55.5%, and with the offensive talent this team has, that cannot continue. According to Kiper, Aon is extremely talented, has not allowed a sack since 2023, sustains blocks, and gets to the second level effectively, which would obviously benefit Jared Goff, Jahmyr Gibbs, and David Montgomery. On paper, the player makes sense. There is no denying that he would look good in Honolulu blue and silver. The problem is not the talent, it is the timing and the priority. The Lions already invested in guard Tate Ratledge in the second round of the 2025 draft. They have Christian Mahogany and Miles Frazier competing on the left side, and Ratledge penciled in on the right. There is also a strong belief that the Lions will address the center position through free agency. We do not know who yet, but that expectation is very real. Because of that, using the 17th overall pick on another guard feels like a luxury this roster cannot afford right now. The bigger issue, and the one that keeps coming up over and over, is tackle. Offensive tackle is the priority, especially with the uncertainty surrounding Taylor Decker. There is real speculation that Decker could retire, and if he does not, there is also talk about a possible release to save significant cap space. Decker dealt with a shoulder injury this year, and that absolutely affected his play. This is not about disrespecting what he has done for the franchise. If he retires, most people can live with that. If the Lions simply release him without a clear succession plan, that becomes much harder to justify. Decker has always been a team-first guy, and if something happens, it is likely because it was discussed internally with the best interest of the team in mind. Brad Holmes has talked before about liking to draft positions a year early rather than a year late, and that philosophy points directly to tackle. You cannot go into a season with this level of expectation and leave such a critical position unsettled. That is why, despite liking the guard prospect, many believe the Lions will go tackle at 17. Names like Francis Mauigoa from Miami come up immediately. He is viewed as incredibly talented, possibly too talented to still be available at 17, which could force the Lions to consider trading up. If he were somehow there, it would be a no-brainer situation. You take him, figure out whether he plays right or left tackle, and suddenly the offensive line picture becomes much clearer. Other realistic options include Caden Proctor from Alabama, a big-bodied lineman who can play on the edge and offers flexibility, and Spencer Fano from Utah, another player who fits Detroit's physical profile. Some may prefer other linemen over him, but the key point is that tackle has to be addressed. That is the foundation of everything this offense wants to be, especially if Jared Goff is going to continue operating at a high level.
All of this also sits within a changing NFC North landscape. Coaching movement matters, and it affects the Lions whether we like it or not. The Green Bay Packers losing Jeff Hafley, who is set to become the next head coach of the Miami Dolphins, removes a defensive coordinator who helped stabilize and elevate that unit. At the same time, the Minnesota Vikings retaining Brian Flores with an extension means the Lions are likely going to continue dealing with one of the toughest defensive minds in the division. Flores has proven he can cause real problems, and unless he lands a head coaching job elsewhere, he is not going anywhere in the short term. So when you put all of this together, from Hutchinson's awards recognition, to draft strategy, to offensive line uncertainty, to divisional coaching stability, you start to see how interconnected this offseason really is. Nothing exists in isolation, and every decision will ripple into the next season and beyond. With that in mind, how do you feel about the Lions' direction right now, especially when it comes to prioritizing tackle over guard and managing the future of Taylor Decker? Because when you zoom out, this is really about timing and windows, and the Lions are officially in a window where mistakes are amplified. A few years ago, you could justify developmental picks, luxury selections, or patience plays. That era is over. This roster is built to compete right now, and every move Brad Holmes makes is going to be judged through that lens. That is why the offensive line conversation keeps circling back to urgency. You could appreciate Mel Kiper Jr.'s logic and still disagree with the conclusion. Interior help matters, no doubt, but edge protection matters more when you are talking about sustaining a playoff-caliber offense across an entire season. And that urgency extends beyond just the draft board. The possible turnover on the offensive line is real, and it is not limited to Taylor Decker. Dan Skipper is another name that could be gone. Decisions around veteran contracts, health, and cap flexibility are all converging at the same time. This is exactly why the Lions cannot afford to wait until a problem fully hits before addressing it. If Decker retires, you are suddenly scrambling. If he stays but declines further due to injury, you are exposed. The Lions have preached proactive roster building, and this offseason is a direct test of that philosophy. At the same time, the Lions are trying to keep the core identity of this team intact. Physicality up front, discipline, and cohesion are what allowed this offense to function at such a high level when things were clicking. That is also why the Hutchinson conversation matters more than just awards. His presence, production, and leadership set the tone for what this team expects from its stars. He came back from a serious injury and still performed at an elite level. That sends a message internally. It raises the standard. When your best players are doing that, the front office has an obligation to support them with the right pieces around them. Looking at the NFC North, the margin for error is not getting bigger. Green Bay may lose a defensive coordinator, but they are not going away. Minnesota keeping Brian Flores is a problem, plain and simple. His defenses are aggressive, confusing, and specifically built to exploit protection weaknesses. If the Lions go into next season with unresolved questions at tackle, Flores will find them. That is not speculation, that is history. Chicago remains a wild card, but divisional games are never easy, and the Lions cannot afford to assume regression elsewhere will save them. This is why the draft pick at 17 feels so important. It is not just about the player, it is about the message. Taking a tackle says you are serious about protecting your quarterback, extending the effectiveness of your run game, and future-proofing the offense. Taking a guard, even a very good one, risks feeling like a move that ignores the bigger picture. The Lions have done too much work to put themselves in position to contend to start cutting corners now. And let's not forget, free agency is still part of this equation. A veteran center addition could stabilize the interior overnight. That would allow the Lions to focus their premium draft capital on the edge, where it is hardest to find immediate impact players. This is roster construction 101 for teams that expect to be playing deep into January. Balance your resources. Spend high picks where scarcity and impact collide. As this offseason unfolds, there's going to be noise, speculation, and strong opinions on every possible move. That is what happens when expectations rise. But at the core of it all, the path feels fairly clear. Support Hutchinson by keeping the offense functional and explosive. Support Goff by keeping him upright. Stay ahead of roster turnover instead of reacting to it. And make decisions that reflect a team that believes its best football is happening right now, not someday in the future. If you're watching this and thinking about where you stand on all of this, now's the time to sound off. Do you agree that tackle has to be the priority at 17, or would you still consider going interior offensive line if the board falls a certain way? And even after all of that, the conversation still does not really end, because this offseason is going to be fluid from the moment free agency opens until the Lions are officially on the clock in April. One signing, one retirement decision, one unexpected release around the league can completely shift how pick 17 is viewed inside Allen Park. That is why Brad Holmes and this front office are staying flexible, and it is why fans should be prepared for scenarios that look very different from what mock drafts suggest right now. Mock drafts are snapshots in time, not blueprints, and Detroit has shown repeatedly that they are willing to zig when everyone expects them to zag. What cannot change, though, is the standard this team is holding itself to. The Lions are no longer chasing respect. They have it. Now they are chasing consistency and postseason success. That means reducing weaknesses that showed up under pressure, especially against disciplined, aggressive defenses. Protection issues do not always show up in box scores, but they show up in timing, comfort, and execution, and that is where games are quietly won or lost. If the Lions truly want to take the next step, those details have to be addressed head-on. This also circles back to leadership in the locker room. Veterans like Taylor Decker matter, not just because of snaps played, but because of what they represent culturally. If his time in Detroit is ending, however it happens, the transition has to be handled cleanly and with intention. You cannot replace that presence overnight. Drafting a tackle early is not just about talent, it is about beginning the next chapter responsibly, instead of scrambling after the fact. And as much as we focus on offense, the defense is watching all of this unfold too. Aiden Hutchinson and the rest of that unit benefit when the offense controls games, sustains drives, and keeps them fresh. Complementary football is not a buzzword here, it is a necessity, especially in a division where adjustments and physicality define late-season matchups. Everything connects, from the trenches outward. So as rumors continue, as names rise and fall on draft boards, and as fans debate every possible outcome, remember this: the Lions are finally operating from a position of strength. The decisions are hard because the stakes are high, not because the foundation is weak. That is a good place to be, even if it makes the offseason feel tense. And that tension you feel right now as a Lions fan, that constant back and forth between optimism and anxiety, is actually the clearest sign of how far this franchise has come. For years, the offseason was about hope in the abstract. Now it is about execution. Every rumor feels heavier because it could actually affect a team with real expectations. That is not something to shy away from, it is something to embrace. What stands out most in everything we are discussing is how intentional the Lions need to be. This is not a roster that needs a miracle. It needs refinement. It needs protection to match its playmakers. It needs stability to support its stars. And it needs foresight, not reaction. That is why the debate around pick 17 feels so personal for fans. You can see the path. You can see where things could go wrong if the wrong decision is made. And you can also see how close this team is to checking every major box. The front office has earned trust, but trust does not mean blind faith. It means understanding the philosophy and judging the results. Brad Holmes has shown he values the trenches, development, and long-term planning. This upcoming draft pick is another chance to prove that those principles still guide the process now that the Lions are contenders, not rebuilders. The margin for error is smaller, but the reward is much bigger. And while names will continue to change, the core questions will not. How do you protect Jared Goff over a full season? How do you keep the run game dominant regardless of who is lining up next to him? How do you make life easier for Aiden Hutchinson by controlling tempo and field position? Those questions all point back to the same place: the offensive line, and more specifically, the edge. This is why the Lions' offseason cannot be judged by one move alone. It is the combination of draft decisions, free agency additions, and internal development that will define whether this team takes another step forward or stalls. The foundation is there. The stars are there. Now it is about connecting the final pieces with precision. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear: the Lions are no longer waiting for the future. They are building for right now, and every decision from here on out is a reflection of that mindset. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the Lions are one smart draft away from taking the next step, or do you think there are still too many unanswered questions heading into the season? And even beyond all the technical talk, there is an emotional layer to this offseason that cannot be ignored. Lions fans have lived through enough resets, false starts, and rebuilds to know how fragile momentum can be. That is why every decision feels personal. It is not just about schemes or contracts. It is about protecting something that finally feels real. This team has an identity now. It is tough, disciplined, physical, and confident. The challenge is making sure that identity does not erode through hesitation or miscalculation. You can feel that the front office understands this moment. They are not chasing headlines. They are trying to sustain relevance. That means resisting the temptation to make a pick just because the player is talented, and instead asking whether that player solves a real problem at the right time. Guard is valuable, no one disputes that, but tackle is foundational. If the Lions get that wrong, everything else becomes harder than it needs to be. And this is where patience and aggression have to coexist. Patience in letting the board come to you. Aggression in being willing to move if your guy is there. The best teams do not draft scared, but they also do not draft casually. Detroit is learning how to operate in that space, and this draft is another test of that growth. As fans, all you can really do is evaluate the logic. Does the move protect the quarterback? Does it stabilize the offense? Does it help this team win in January, not just look good on paper in April? If the answer is yes,